34% of working mothers are being forced to make a choice no parent should ever have to make: leave their child in an uncertain situation or leave their career forever. For single Black mothers, that number is even higher, and the consequences are catastrophic. This is the real story behind every headline about a child left at work, a system designed to fail the people who need it most. This is the hidden crisis forcing millions of parents, especially single Black mothers, to the brink every single day. A perfect storm of soaring costs, vanishing subsidies, and rigid workplace mandates. Childcare now consumes up to 42% of a Black family's median income. When the system fails, parents are labeled neglectful, careers are destroyed, and children pay the price. But what happens when that breaking point arrives? And who, in that desperate moment, actually catches the child? Meet Alicia, a certified nursing assistant in Atlanta, a single mother of two, and for 3 months last year, a woman who started her shift at 6 a.m. with her 4-year-old daughter, Maya, asleep in the break room. Her center had closed with no warning. The subsidy waitlist was 900 families long. Her choice was lose the job that fed them or bring Maya to work and pray no one noticed. This wasn't neglect. This was arithmetic. The average cost for infant care in her state is over $14,000 a year. Her take-home pay was just over $30,000. Do the math. That's why, across the country, break rooms, stock closets, and parked cars have become the secret, desperate daycare centers of America. But here's what the headlines calling this neglect never mention. Only 15% of eligible families actually get the childcare subsidies they qualify for. The system isn't just broken, it's designed to be inaccessible. And while a mother like Alicia is making impossible choices, corporate America is making a different calculation. In the last year alone, full-time in-office mandates at major firms have skyrocketed, erasing the flexible remote work that was keeping millions of mothers employed. When the office demands your body, but the system provides no care for your child, what exactly are you supposed to do? The answer for a growing number is a dangerous gamble. They patch together what experts call informal care networks: a neighbor, a cousin, a friend of a friend who watches kids for cash. It's a $10 billion shadow economy with no regulations, no safety standards, and no guarantee the caregiver will show up tomorrow. And when that patchwork quilt unravels, as it often does, the parent has minutes to find a solution. That's the precise moment the law stops seeing a crisis and starts seeing a crime. Take the case of Maria Rodriguez in Fresno. Her informal caregiver, a woman she found through a Facebook group, simply didn't answer the door one morning. Maria's shift at the warehouse started in 45 minutes. No backup, no family nearby. She drove to work with her 3-year-old son, Leo, in the car, parked near the security camera blind spot, and left him with an iPad and snacks, checking every 20 minutes on her break. She was reported by a coworker. The charge: child endangerment, a potential felony. Her son was placed in temporary state custody. This is the brutal reality. The same system that provides no safe, affordable care will swiftly punish you for not finding any. The psychological toll is a quiet epidemic. 48% of parents now report daily stress that feels completely overwhelming. For single mothers, that number is a staggering 68%, experiencing full parental burnout. It's a constant, grinding calculation of risk versus ruin. Do you risk being late and losing your job, or do you risk leaving your child in a situation that could bring Child Protective Services to your door? This isn't poor planning. This is a national policy failure playing out in the terrified hearts of millions of parents every single morning. And the financial cliff is even steeper for mothers of color. Black families spend on average 42% of their median income on center-based care for 2 children. Compare that to just 20% for white families. This isn't a gap, it's a chasm. It means the crisis hits earlier, harder, and with far fewer resources to soften the fall. When your entire paycheck goes to childcare, working actually costs you money, so you drop out. And that decision has a lifetime cost. Reduced earnings, vanished retirement savings, and a career trajectory permanently derailed. The real trigger, the moment that turns a stressed parent into a headline, is often something small and uncontrollable. A daycare calling about a fever, a traffic jam on the way to the sitter, a last-minute shift change. The margin for error is zero. This was the precise second that Janine Harris, a line cook in Chicago, faced. Her son's after-school program closed early due to a power outage. Her manager refused to let her leave, citing peak hour coverage. With her phone buzzing and no other options, she did the only thing she could think of. She brought her 8-year-old to the hot, noisy kitchen, sat him in the dry storage pantry with a coloring book, and went back to the grill. For 90 minutes it worked. Then a district manager made an unannounced visit. What he saw wasn't a mother in crisis. He saw a liability, a violation, a termination offense. Janine was fired on the spot for bringing an unauthorized person into a food preparation area. Her story isn't an outlier, it's a blueprint. This is how careers end, not with a grand failure, but with a single, desperate, and perfectly understandable decision made in a system that offers no good choices. But what if the story doesn't end with termination? What if, in that moment of sheer desperation, someone looks up from their desk, their counter, their executive office, and sees not a problem but a person? What if the child, left in a strange place, does what children do? They seek connection, they wander, and they find someone unexpected. This is where our story fractures from the predictable path of tragedy. This is where we meet the other side of the equation, the bystander who becomes a lifeline. Consider the data point that changes everything. Only 8% of employers offer any form of emergency backup childcare. 8%. That means 92% of workplaces have no official protocol, no safe harbor when a parent's world collapses at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. So the response becomes personal. It falls on a human being, a coworker, a supervisor, a CEO, to make a split-second choice, enforce the policy, or rewrite it. Now rewind to Alicia and her daughter Maya in the hospital break room. For weeks, a few kind nurses covered for her. They took turns reading reports in the break room, keeping an eye on the little girl coloring at the table. It was a silent conspiracy of care, until the day the conspiracy failed. The floor was short-staffed, a code blue was called, every nurse ran, and for 22 minutes Maya was alone. That's when she did what her mother had begged her not to do. She went looking for her mom. She pushed through the heavy double doors, past the nurse's station, and into a hallway of unfamiliar rooms. She turned a corner and found herself not at her mother's station, but in a quiet suite where a man in a suit was on the phone, staring out a window at the parking lot. He was the hospital's new chief financial officer, going over budget cuts. He turned around. There was a small child in his doorway, holding a stuffed dolphin, asking if he had seen her mama. This was the moment. The policy said call security. The policy said report the employee. The policy said this was a major compliance issue. But the man, David Chen, had a 3-year-old at home. He saw the fear in Maya's eyes, and he saw the invisible thread connecting her to a parent he knew was probably terrified. He hung up the phone. He got down on one knee, and he asked her if her dolphin was hungry. That question, is your dolphin hungry, was the first thread pulled. In asking it, David Chen made a subconscious choice. He was not going to be the bureaucrat in that moment. He was going to be the human. He took Maya's hand, led her to the small sofa in his office, and found granola bars in his desk drawer. For 15 minutes, a hospital CFO whose job was to cut millions in costs sat with a 4-year-old, sharing snacks and talking about sea creatures. He learned her mother's first name, Alicia, and that she worked on the floor with the beeping. He called the head nurse of the medical surgical unit. Do you have an Alicia working today? I have her daughter in my office. The silence on the other end of the line was pure, undiluted dread. When Alicia rushed into the office, her face was a mask of tear-streaked terror. She was already reaching for Maya, already forming the words, "I'm so fired." But David Chen held up a hand, not a stop sign, a pause button. "Before you say anything," he said, his voice quiet, "tell me what happened, just the facts." And for the first time, Alicia told her story not as a confession, but as a case study. The closed daycare, the 900 family wait list, the math that didn't math. She spoke for 4 minutes. David Chen listened for all of them, and when she finished, he didn't reach for the phone to call HR, he reached for a notepad. "Wait here," he said. He left Alicia and Maya in his office, walked down the hall, and instructed his assistant to pull the personnel files for the entire nursing staff. What he was looking for was a pattern, not a perpetrator. What he found in the next hour would redefine his understanding of the hospital's operations. Cross-referencing addresses with publicly available data on childcare desert maps, he estimated that at least 60% of his female nursing staff with young children lived in postal codes with either zero licensed childcare slots or average costs exceeding 50% of their take-home pay. This wasn't one employee breaking a rule. This was a structural time bomb built into his workforce. His nurses weren't just healthcare providers, they were logistical magicians performing daily miracles just to show up, and the hospital's policy was to fire them when the miracle failed. He walked back into his office. Alicia was holding Maya, both of them braced for impact. David looked at them and said the last thing Alicia expected. "You're not fired, but we have a very big problem to solve." That afternoon, David Chen did two things that broke every corporate protocol. First, he authorized an immediate temporary exemption for Alicia, allowing Maya to stay in a newly designated supervised family room near the cafeteria until a permanent solution was found. Second, he emailed the hospital's board with a 3-page memo titled "The Hidden Infrastructure of Our Workforce, Childcare as a Critical Operational Risk." He attached the data. He didn't ask for permission. He stated that the hospital was effectively discriminating against employees who were parents, primarily women, and that the resulting stress and attrition were directly impacting patient care metrics and ballooning recruitment costs. He CC'd legal. The response was not warm, it was ice cold. The board saw liability, not humanity. Their chief counsel fired back a terse reply outlining the monumental legal risks, insurance violations, OSHA concerns, precedent setting. "We cannot become a daycare," the email concluded. "Our policy is clear: terminate the employee and reinforce the standard." This is the precise wall where good intentions usually die. The bureaucratic immune system kicks in, identifies the anomaly, and crushes it. David was given a direct order: rescind the exemption and begin Alicia's termination process. He had 24 hours to comply, but David had spent the afternoon with Maya. He had seen the relief on Alicia's face, a physical weight lifting. He had also, in his data dive, found the turnover rate for single mother nurses at his hospital, 42% in the first year. The cost to replace one nurse, roughly $50,000. He wasn't looking at a compassion case anymore. He was looking at a $50,000 per head business defect with a human face. So he made a third decision, the riskiest one yet. He didn't rescind the exemption. Instead, he called a reporter from the local paper, a woman who had written about healthcare disparities. He gave her the broad strokes off the record: a dedicated nurse, a broken system, a child in an office. He didn't name Alicia, he named the problem. The reporter, intrigued, started digging. She filed public records requests for childcare subsidy data in the county. She interviewed other nurses at the hospital, anonymously. Within days, she had not one story, but 5. Stories of nurses sleeping in their cars between shifts because they couldn't afford rent and childcare. Stories of night shift workers paying teenagers under the table to watch sleeping kids, hoping nothing went wrong. The dam of silence was breaking. And then the story found its second wind. A photo, taken on a smartphone by another nurse and texted to the reporter, showed the family room, a small conference room with coloring books and a toddler gate. In the corner, Maya napped on a cot, and beside her, reading a budget report, was David Chen. The caption that spread online was simple: "This is the CFO of Atlanta General. He's doing his job and babysitting because the system failed his employee." The image went microviral. It was a Rorschach test. Some saw a hero, others saw a dangerous precedent. Management saw mutiny. The board called an emergency meeting. David was told to attend and to bring his resignation letter. While the executives were debating his career, the story was mutating in the public sphere. It jumped from local news to national parenting blogs, then to morning talk shows. The framing shifted subtly. It was no longer just about one hospital. It was about the question: where are the children of America's essential workers right now? The #secret daycare started trending. Parents, mostly mothers, began sharing their own desperate stories and secret solutions. The break room closets, the underdesk forts, the bring your child to work day that happened every day for them. The scale of the hidden crisis was suddenly, vividly visible, and the spotlight swung back to Atlanta General, not as a villain, but as a petri dish. What would they do? The pressure created a fracture. The hospital's head of human resources, a woman named Carol, had remained silent through the board's directives. She had 3 grandchildren. She'd been quietly tracking the attrition of her best nurses for years. The public scrutiny gave her an opening. She bypassed the board, and went directly to the hospital's largest union. Together, they drafted a formal proposal, a pilot on-site emergency childcare assistance program funded by reallocating a fraction of the annual recruitment budget. The math was undeniable. The $50,000 it cost to replace one nurse could cover a year of emergency backup care for 10. It wasn't a full solution. It was a safety net, and it was politically explosive. The board, now facing a potential union fight and a public relations disaster, was cornered. They gave David Chen a final ultimatum: shut down the family room immediately, denounce the union proposal, and issue a public statement affirming the existing policy, or be fired for gross insubordination. They scheduled a press conference for 10 a.m. the next morning. David went home that night, sat at his kitchen table, and stared at the photo on his phone, the one of him and Maya in the family room. He thought about the order, the obedience expected, and he thought about the email he'd received that afternoon from a nurse in the oncology unit. It read, "My son is in my car in the parking garage. I have no other option for the next 3 hours. Thank you for making it slightly less terrifying to be a mother who also needs to work." He knew what he had to do. He wouldn't issue their statement. He would issue his own. At 9:55 the next morning, outside the hospital's main entrance, with local news cameras rolling, the board chairman stepped to the microphone to reaffirm the hospital's strict policy. But before he could speak, a different figure walked into the frame. It was Alicia. She was in her scrubs, holding Maya's hand. She had not been invited. She had been inspired. She walked directly to the bank of microphones, her voice clear and shaking only slightly. "My name is Alicia Johnson. I'm a nurse here. This is my daughter, Maya. For weeks, I brought her to work because I had no safe place for her to go. I was terrified every second. Then she wandered off, and instead of firing me, Mr. Chen saw a problem we could solve together. That family room isn't a liability. It's a lifeline. How many lifelines are you willing to cut to protect a policy that's failing your people?" She turned, picked up Maya, and walked back into the hospital to start her shift. The board chairman never got to deliver his statement. The narrative had been hijacked, not by a CFO, but by the very person the policies were meant to silence. In the chaos that followed, the union seized the moment. They called for an immediate vote on the childcare proposal. Reporters flooded the switchboard. Social media erupted. The hospital's board, masters of a quiet, controlled bureaucracy, were now starring in a very public, very messy drama about motherhood and modern work. They retreated to decide their next move, but the story had already escaped their walls. It was replicating. In a tech office in Austin, a software engineer saw the news segment. She had been hiding her breastfeeding pump breaks and lying about pediatrician appointments for a year. She forwarded the article to every woman in her department with the subject line, "This is us." In a school cafeteria in Denver, a lunch worker who kept her grandson in the manager's office during early prep hours printed out the picture of David and Maya and taped it to the staff fridge. The Whisper Network was becoming a rallying cry. And then the first domino fell in an unexpected place. Not a hospital, but a massive retail chain headquartered in the Midwest. Their CEO, a grandmother of 7, saw the coverage and issued a company-wide memo. It began, "We have been asking the wrong question. We ask, why can't our employees find childcare? We should be asking, what is our responsibility as their employer?" She announced a partnership with a national backup care network, giving every employee 10 days of subsidized emergency childcare per year. The cost to the company, less than 0.1% of annual profits. The statement ended with a direct challenge to other Fortune 500 companies. The business case had been made. The moral case was now being televised. The crisis of secret daycare was secret no more. But for every Alicia who found an unlikely ally, there were 100 parents with no David Chen. Their stories were about to collide with the system's sharpest teeth, the law. While the media celebrated a feel-good story in Atlanta, in a courtroom in Phoenix, a different scene was unfolding. A single father named Marcus, a warehouse foreman, was on trial for child neglect. His story was a mirror image, but without a rescuer. His shift started at 5 a.m., his daycare opened at 7. For months, he'd left his 6-year-old daughter in his locked truck for 2 hours with a phone, games, and strict instructions. A security guard had noticed and called the police. The prosecutor's opening statement framed it not as a desperate act of a loving parent, but as a clear, willful endangerment. The law, in its stark black and white, had no column for no other choice. Marcus was facing up to 2 years in prison and the permanent loss of custody. His public defender had one desperate move left. She asked the judge to allow testimony not just about Marcus, but about the context, the childcare desert map of his neighborhood, the subsidy waitlist, the reality that his pre-shift existed in a time slot no licensed care in the state was required to cover. The judge, skeptical, allowed it. The stage was set for a legal battle that would test whether "I had no choice" was a defense or just an admission of guilt. This is where our story splits into two parallel tracks. One track is hopeful, messy, and human, the path of Alicia and David, where a single act of empathy forces an institution to bend. The other track is cold, punitive, and rigid, the path of Marcus, where the same desperation leads to a courtroom and a cell. These two tracks are racing toward each other. And the collision point will be a single, unanswered question that now hangs over every workplace, every courtroom, every kitchen table in America. When the village has completely collapsed, who picks up the child? And what happens to the parent left holding the broken pieces? The prosecutor in Marcus's trial called it a pattern of calculated neglect. He presented the security footage of the little girl in the truck, the temperature readings from that morning, and the text messages Marcus had sent to his boss begging for a schedule change that never came. The defense's attempt to introduce context, the childcare desert maps, the subsidy waitlist, was met with sustained objections. "Relevance, Your Honor?" the prosecutor asked. The law doesn't have an exception for inconvenience, and in that moment, the entire case crystallized. This wasn't about one father's choice. This was about whether the system's failure could be used as a legal defense. The judge, after a long pause, sustained the objection. The context was inadmissible. Marcus's reality, the impossible math of pre-dawn shifts and 9-to-5 daycare, was deemed legally irrelevant. He was convicted of misdemeanor child neglect. Sentence: 90 days in jail, 3 years of probation, and his daughter placed in foster care for the duration of his incarceration. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked at the public defender and said one word: "How?" That how echoed far beyond the Phoenix courtroom. The verdict made national news, but with a chilling new framing. Headlines read, "Father jailed for lack of childcare and the criminalization of parenting while poor." The conversation shifted from sympathy to systemic outrage. And in Atlanta, the hospital board watched this new narrative unfold with growing dread. The Marcus case was a looking glass, showing them the brutal endgame of their own rigid policies. The union used it masterfully, circulating an internal memo: "Atlanta General's current policy is the first step on the path to Phoenix. Is this who we are?" The pressure was no longer just public relations, it was moral, and it was inescapable. David Chen, however, was already out. The board had accepted his resignation the morning after Alicia's press conference stunt. His corporate career was over, but as he cleared his desk, he received a phone call. It was the CEO of the retail chain that had just launched the backup care program. She said, "I saw what you did. I need someone who understands that our biggest cost isn't childcare. It's the talent we lose because we won't provide it." She offered him a role as Vice President of Workforce Sustainability. His first task: designing a scalable, nationwide emergency care model. David's fall from one corporate ladder became a leap onto a bigger one, with a mandate to change the very rules that had pushed him out. The individual had been punished, but the idea he championed was now being funded by a Fortune 500 company. But here, where it gets worse. Just as the Marcus verdict was sparking outrage, a new study dropped from the Brookings Institution. It revealed a hidden data point that shattered every assumption. Researchers had cross-referenced Child Protective Services reports with parental work schedules. They found that reports of neglect for lack of supervision spiked by over 300% during hours when no licensed childcare centers in the entire country were legally required to be open, specifically evenings, weekends, and before 7 a.m. The system wasn't just failing to provide care during these hours, it was then punishing parents for the gap it created. The study's lead author called it state-sanctioned entrapment. This wasn't an anecdote anymore. It was a statistically proven, nationwide pattern of criminalizing parents for working non-standard hours, which disproportionately meant low-wage workers, single parents, and people of color. This data became a rocket booster for the movement. Legislators in 15 states, facing media scrutiny and advocacy campaigns, introduced Marcus's law bills, proposals to amend child neglect statutes to include a hardship defense for parents who could prove they lacked access to affordable, appropriate childcare. The bills were wildly controversial. Opponents argued they would decriminalize child endangerment. Proponents said they would stop criminalizing poverty. The battle lines were drawn in state houses across the country, with real parents like Alicia and Marcus testifying before skeptical committees. And then the second domino fell, this time from within the beast. A mid-level manager at a major insurance company in Hartford, a woman named Linda, read about the Marcus case and the Brookings study. She had 2 toddlers and a nanny share that cost more than her mortgage. She also had access to the company's internal diversity and inclusion survey data. On a hunch, she ran a correlation. The results were staggering. Female employees with children under 5 were 40% more likely to report intention to leave within the next year. The single biggest predictor wasn't pay or promotion, it was perceived inflexibility of care logistics. She took the data, anonymized it, and sent it to the CEO with a subject line: "The leak in our talent pipeline is a childcare-shaped hole." This time, the data didn't come from an activist or a newspaper. It came from the internal business intelligence of a conservative, risk-averse corporation. It was impossible to ignore. The CEO called an emergency meeting of the executive team. The head of actuarial sciences, the person whose job it is to calculate risk, presented the numbers. The cost of replacing just the women likely to leave due to childcare stress was projected at over $20 million annually. The cost of implementing a backup care program, less than $2 million. The business case was so clear it was embarrassing. The company announced a pilot program the following week. The dam of corporate resistance was cracking from the inside. For every step forward, there was a brutal step back. While corporations were slowly waking up, the ground-level crisis was spiraling. In Houston, a mother working as a hotel housekeeper was fired after her 7-year-old son, who she had been forced to bring to work and hide in a linen closet, was discovered by a guest. The hotel, part of a major chain, cited a zero-tolerance policy. The mother, undocumented, had no recourse. She and her son became homeless within a month. Her story never made the news. It was absorbed into the silent, grinding reality of the crisis. This was the untold counter-narrative. For every Alicia who found a David Chen, there were thousands who found only a closed door and a pink slip. The collision of these two realities, the hopeful corporate pilots and the silent, crushing desperation, created a volatile political moment. Advocacy groups, sensing a tipping point, organized a national day without childcare protest. Parents kept their kids home. Daycare centers closed in solidarity. The goal was to show the economy what happens when the invisible labor of childcare suddenly vanishes. And it worked. In cities across the country, workplaces were disrupted. Restaurants couldn't open because dishwashers and servers stayed home. Offices were half empty. The economic impact was immediate and tangible. For one day, the hidden infrastructure was made visible, and its value was measured in billions in lost productivity. The protest caught the attention of the one group that had remained largely silent: investors. A coalition of institutional shareholders, managing over $1 trillion in assets, issued a directive to the companies in their portfolios. They demanded disclosure of childcare-related workforce risks, attrition rates, productivity losses, and diversity metrics. They framed it not as a social issue, but as a material financial risk, the same way they would demand disclosure of climate change liabilities. Suddenly, childcare was a boardroom metric, a line item on an ESG report. The language of the crisis had been translated into the only dialect corporate America truly understands: risk and return. This set the stage for the final, and most personal, collision. Marcus, now out of jail and fighting to get his daughter back from foster care, was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee holding hearings on the childcare crisis. He would be sitting at the same witness table as David Chen, the former CFO, now a corporate vice president advocating for employer solutions. They were the two faces of the same crisis, one punished by the system, one paid by the system to fix it. The hearing was titled "The Cost of Care: Families, Work, and the Future of the American Economy." The night before the hearing, David Chen requested a meeting with Marcus. They sat in a bland hotel conference room in Washington, D.C., two men from worlds that should never have met. Marcus, wary and hardened by his ordeal. David, earnest and carrying the weight of his own privilege. David began by apologizing for the system for his part in it. Marcus cut him off. "I don't need your apology," he said. "I need you to tell those politicians the truth. Tell them it's not a choice. It's a trap, and tell them the trap has a race and a zip code." David nodded. He had his polished corporate presentation ready, but he also had a last-minute addition, a slide with Marcus's daughter's drawing, which she had made in foster care, of her dad and a big red truck. The next morning, in a packed hearing room, under the glare of C-SPAN cameras, the two men told their stories back to back. Marcus spoke of the terror of leaving his daughter, the cold efficiency of the courtroom, the ache of her absence. He held up the drawing. "This is what the law did. It called me a criminal and gave my kid a foster home. That's the solution we have right now." Then it was David's turn. He spoke of data, of turnover costs, of risk management. And then he paused, looked at Marcus and said, "But all of my numbers, all of my corporate models are just the economic echo of that man's story. We are measuring the cost of our own cruelty, and we are billing it as a business expense." He then did something unscripted. He turned to the lawmakers and said, "The question isn't whether we can afford to fix this. The question is whether you have the political will to stop funding the breaking of families." The room was silent. Then the committee chair, a veteran senator, leaned into her microphone. Her question was not for David, but for Marcus. "Mr. Jefferson, if you could have had one thing, one change that morning, what would it have been?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "A place, just a safe, warm place she could have been for those 2 hours, that's all. A place." That simple, devastating answer, a place, hung in the air. It reframed the entire billion-dollar debate into a question of basic human infrastructure. As the hearing concluded, a staffer handed the committee chair a note. She read it, her expression changing. She gavelled the room to attention. "I have just been informed," she said, "that the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve, in a speech this morning, has explicitly cited the childcare crisis as a structural drag on labor force participation and economic growth, and called for public-private investment in care infrastructure with the same urgency as roads and bridges." The political calculus had just changed at the highest level. The crisis was now officially a macroeconomic problem. Outside the hearing room, Marcus and David stood together in the hallway. Reporters swarmed, asking if this was the start of real change. Marcus looked at the cameras and said, "My daughter is still in foster care, so you tell me." David, standing beside him, knew the corporate wheels would now turn faster, but he also knew they turned too slowly for the Marcuses of the world. The two tracks, the punitive and the hopeful, had finally converged on a national stage, revealing a system at war with itself, one that could jail a father for a problem it refused to solve, while simultaneously asking corporations to profit from solving it. This was the inflection point. The problem had been diagnosed, debated, and dramatized. The economic cost had been quantified. The human cost had been televised. The only question left was the hardest one: who would build the place that Marcus's daughter needed, and what would it take to build it for every child, for every parent, before the next desperate decision had to be made? The week after the congressional hearing, two things happened that seemed unrelated. In Phoenix, a family court judge reviewed Marcus Jefferson's case in light of the new national discourse and the testimony about childcare deserts. In a rare judicial reversal, she vacated the neglect adjudication, terminated the dependency case, and ordered his daughter returned to him immediately. The ruling stated that while the father's actions involved risk, they occurred in a context of systematic market failure, and that the state's interest was better served by supporting the family than by punishing it. Marcus walked out of the courthouse holding his daughter's hand for the first time in 4 months. There were no cameras waiting. The victory was quiet, administrative, and life-altering. In Atlanta, the hospital board, now facing investor pressure and a union vote they were sure to lose, capitulated. They approved the 6-month pilot for an on-site emergency childcare room, staffed by a rotating roster of retired nurses and funded by reallocating recruitment dollars. Alicia Johnson was not just rehired, she was promoted to a newly created role, family care liaison. Her first task was to design the room's protocols. The first child to use it on the pilot's opening day was her daughter, Maya. The circle closed, but it was just one circle in an ocean of need. These two outcomes, one legal, one corporate, became the proof points for a movement that was rapidly shifting from protest to policy. Within 3 months of the Fed chair's remarks, a bipartisan coalition in Congress introduced the Child Care Infrastructure Act. It wasn't a universal program. It was a strategic patch: tax credits for employers who provided backup care, grants to extend operating hours for centers in childcare deserts, and federal matching funds for states that adopted hardship defense provisions in their neglect laws. It was a messy, pragmatic, and profoundly American solution, using the market to fix a market failure. It passed as a rider on a must-pass defense bill. The victory was in the details, and in the unprecedented coalition that backed it, the Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO. The corporate dominoes fell faster. By the end of the fiscal year, over 60 major employers had announced some form of emergency childcare support, driven less by altruism and more by the newly quantified risk of not doing so. David Chen's model, refined and scaled, became an industry standard. He found himself in a strange new role, a corporate executive whose key performance indicator was how many parents he kept in the workforce. He kept a photo on his desk, Marcus's daughter's drawing of the red truck. But the most profound change was cultural, and it was measured in silence. The number of anonymous tips to Child Protective Services for child left unattended in vehicle dropped by nearly 20% in the following year, even as reporting mechanisms remained the same. Researchers hypothesized that the public conversation had created a new layer of social understanding. Bystanders were now slightly more likely to ask a parent, "Do you need help?" than to immediately call the police. The stigma was shifting, molecule by molecule. For Alicia, the change was tangible. With stable childcare, she completed her nurse practitioner certification. Her salary doubled. She moved out of her apartment complex and into a home with a yard. The day she signed the mortgage, she framed the first pay stub from her new job and hung it next to the photo of Maya and David Chen in the family room. It was a receipt for a different life. Yet the core math remained unforgiving for millions. The average cost of care continued to outpace inflation. The subsidy waitlists in most states were still years long. The Infrastructure Act was a down payment, not a solution. And in the gap between policy and reality, the old, desperate patterns continued. In Tulsa, a single mother working at a call center was fired after her manager found her 6-year-old playing quietly in a storage cubicle. She didn't have a David Chen. She had a rule book. This is the enduring truth the crisis revealed. Systemic change is a fractal. It looks like a sweeping federal law from a distance, but up close, it's 1,000 individual battles in break rooms and courtrooms and boardrooms. It requires both the hammer of law and the suture of human empathy. And sometimes, it requires a child to wander into an office and ask a question about a dolphin. Now for the final, surprising detail. 18 months after the pilot began, Atlanta General's emergency family room was so successful in reducing nurse turnover that the hospital expanded it into a full-scale, 24-hour childcare center, open to all hospital staff and the surrounding community. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was covered by the local news. The board chairman, who had once demanded David Chen's resignation, gave a speech about innovation and supporting the healthcare family. Standing beside him were Alicia and Maya, and standing slightly off to the side, holding a pair of small pink scissors to help cut the ribbon, was the former chief financial officer, David Chen. He had been invited back as a guest of honor. After the ceremony, he handed Alicia a small gift. It was a framed photo she had never seen before. It was taken from behind on that first day, showing him crouched next to Maya on the office sofa, both of them looking at her stuffed dolphin. On the back, he had written, "The most important budget line item we ever created. Thank you for teaching me how to see it." The story that began with a terrified mother and a wandering child ended with a building, a policy, and a photo. But it didn't end there, because the next morning in a different city, a different mother would face a different impossible choice. The system is still broken, but now it has cracks, and in those cracks, light is getting in. The new question is no longer, how did this happen? It's, what are we going to do next? This is where our documentary's narrative ends, but the real story is just entering its next act. The lesson is clear. We built an economy that separates parents from children for 8 to 10 hours a day, and then we punished them when the connection couldn't be severed cleanly. The fix isn't just about care. It's about value. It's about finally valuing the work of raising the next generation as highly as we value the work of building the next quarter's profits. We leave you with one last image. It's from a security camera, time-stamped 7:23 a.m. on a random Tuesday. It shows the main entrance of Atlanta General. Nurses and doctors stream in. Among them is Alicia, in her new scrubs, holding Maya's hand. They walk past the information desk, past the gift shop, and instead of turning toward the break room, they turn toward a bright hallway with a sign that reads Sunrise Center. Maya lets go of her mother's hand, runs ahead, and pushes open the door. Inside, other children are arriving. A teacher greets her by name. Alicia watches for a moment, then turns and walks toward the elevator that will take her to her patients. She does not look back. She doesn't have to. That simple act, a child walking through one door, a parent walking through another, both secure, should not be a radical outcome. It should be the baseline expectation of a functioning society. What we witnessed in this story is not a miracle. It is a correction. A slow, painful, and uneven correction to a system that demanded parents be in two places at once and then punished them for being human. The real measure of progress won't be in more viral stories of rescue. It will be in their obsolescence. It will be when a parent never has to choose between their child's safety and their job's security. When I had no choice ceases to be a desperate confession and becomes an unthinkable statement. We are not there yet. The data tells us we are decades away, but the cracks are now visible and pressure is building in every one of them. This was never just about childcare. It is about the fundamental architecture of work and family. For generations, we designed an economy that pretended care happened by magic, off the books, in the invisible labor of almost always women. That fiction is collapsing. The cost is now on the books, in turnover reports, in prison rolls, in the silent withdrawal of talent from our workforce. The business case has been made. The moral case was never in doubt. The only thing left is the doing. So what do we do with this knowledge? We look around. We ask the question David Chen finally asked: what is the real problem here? In our workplaces, in our schools, in our voting booths, we stop accepting that's just how it is as an answer to a solvable problem. The most powerful tool we have is no longer just empathy, but the cold, hard data that makes change inevitable. Use both. Thank you for spending this time in the difficult, beautiful, and urgent space where family life meets economic reality. This story was built from countless real voices and real struggles. If it resonated with you, if you've ever faced an impossible choice or watched someone you love navigate one, we want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. Tell us what one change would have made all the difference. If this documentary opened your eyes, please share it. Pass it to a friend, a co-worker, a manager, a lawmaker. Help turn understanding into action. And if you want to join us as we keep telling the stories that rewrite the rules, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We are just getting started. Remember this: every system was built by people, and every system can be rebuilt. Sometimes it starts with a child wandering into an office. Sometimes it starts with you deciding to pay attention.